Good afternoon, everyone. Tim Caldwell with AOTMP, and I'm joined by Brandon Hampton with MOBI.
Hey, everybody. How you doing?
We're looking forward to sharing some great information today with you about individually liable wireless devices. And to set us up here a bit, there are certainly many organizations that are taking a look at all the different wireless strategies that they may wish to employ to support not only their internal business needs, but also to support user needs and user demands. And as we take a look at these, we want to lay out several different options and different strategies that can be employed, and certainly speak to how MOBI is supporting many different organizations today and the different models that are being used. So with that, let's go to the next slide. There are several different ways in which organizations can approach wireless management. There can be individual liable type programs, there can be corporate liable type programs, and several different blends. There are several different motivators for making decisions about different approaches that you may take in your organization. One of the most common considerations is savings and hard dollar cost savings. One of the things that AOTMP has identified through our research of enterprises is that 65% of enterprises cite cost saving as their primary driver from moving from a corporate liable type program to an individual type, liable type program. And in addition to that, in thinking about the dollars and pennies that are being spent on the services themselves and the wireless plans, the average corporate liable plan is around $57 per user a month, while individual liable reimbursement plans are around $47. Just simply using that and multiplying it out by the number of users you may have in your organization, certainly there could potentially be a lot of savings. So in thinking about hard dollar cost savings, driving down the cost of supporting the wireless plans is one of the key motivators. What thoughts might you have on what you've experienced, Brandon, with enterprise experience around hard dollar cost savings and that being a motivator for moving to IL?
I think it's always the primary motivator. It's always the one that kind of drives this initially as companies have seen wireless costs escalate over the recent years. So I think it's always the main motivator initially. I think a lot of times when companies actually dig into how much they can save, they're surprised that it's not as much as they think. And I think a lot of that is due to what their plans are with regard to stipends or allowing users to expense certain portion of it, and what they miss a lot of times is that there's a significant amount of time and investment required to support those users even after they move to IL. So and then the stipend typically is going to be higher to keep people happy than what they anticipate in the beginning. So as you can see, there's only a $10 difference, and when you factor in support costs, I think it becomes almost a wash.
Right, and these numbers, I will say, are thinking specifically about the cost of the wireless plans, and so those are the monthly service plans. And while there certainly may be many large dollars identified there when you multiply that out, the cost of support of not only the users from an implementation perspective, but an ongoing basis can certainly and should certainly be factored into this as well. One of the other elements that often goes into the decision, one of the drivers, is soft cost savings. And certainly there are many different areas and aspects of soft dollar savings. Some organizations that have many procurement cycles, activate many devices, make many changes to plans. Certainly that takes time, effort, and energy. There's also this thought that if you have a corporate liable plan or corporate liable plans, and you need to support bill payment, you need to investigate billing issues, identify invoice to contract compliance, that takes people resources, time, effort, and energy to do that. So in thinking about soft dollar cost savings and where efficiencies can be gained, and to the point that you made earlier, oftentimes organizations think if I move off my liability to the users, allow them to select, pay for, and manage their own devices, even if there is a stipend, that often that's just going to be found money, and then support goes away, lots of savings to be had there, almost to the extent of we don't need to worry about that anymore. What's your experience with that phenomenon actually ringing true in an organization?
Yeah, it's in fact, I think that might be one of the biggest misnomers about this type of transition. And while I'm not denying that it's potentially a very good move for certain users within an organization, but whether it's a good move or not, we're finding that the support resources required are, while they're about half what a normal corporate liable user would require, we still average over 2 incidents per year for individual liable users when in dealing with email issues, connectivity issues, if you're offering some kind of a corporate connectivity to email. So we still see the need to support those users. And then on the flip side, we're also seeing companies that when they open up this bring your own device or some kind of a stipend program, they're usually rolling it out to more users. So even though they cut their support time in half, they're adding users, so it oftentimes ends up being almost a wash as well. So I think companies, again, are not as it's not as rosy on the other side of the fence as a lot of people think.
Yeah. Often one of the questions that I hear is an approach that says, should I be corporate liable, should I be individual liable, as if they're two absolutes and there's no in between. One of the things, however, that I often bring up in those discussions is that often there isn't a singular answer to the question, what is best or which way should I go? And part of it is because of the items that you brought up, the decisions around not only hard dollar cost savings, but soft dollar cost savings. If we dig a little bit deeper into the support and into the variables associated with the devices, all indications are that there are more variables today in terms of operating systems that are being deployed, types of devices, makes, models, software revisions, and also types of devices if we bring in tablets and other non-traditional, I'll say, cell phone, smartphone devices that all of a sudden get into this mix of falling under wireless and wireless management. And because of all of the variety and all of the different options there, what effect does that really have on an organization relative to their approach for being able to support it?
Yeah, it's and I think the days of handing the same phone to everybody at a company are long gone. So there are many different types of users that have different requirements, where there are different security needs for different types of users, where some users need tablets, some don't, and think that you can lump everyone into one type of program is I think a little short-sighted. I think there are certainly cases where traditionally they've handed phones to people that maybe didn't need them, maybe they did, but they've been kind of those fence setters. And I think companies reevaluating different profiles within their organization and deciding who needs a phone and who doesn't is a very valuable exercise. And I think it's one that we're seeing a lot of companies undertake right now. And I think they're finding the same thing that we think, that there are different types of programs that will fit within a company. And I think being able to manage the complexity of those different programs is going to be kind of the future of wireless management, and being able to, in a way, inventory users and be able to lump them into the appropriate program based on different aspects that we'll actually discuss in a little bit.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, let's take a look and perhaps define the model so that we can begin to build this view of what an organization might throw into the mix to be able to support them overall. So let's start off with this traditional model. I think just based on the verbiage, this is something that we all know. The organization owns the device. They have the contracts. They pay for the monthly services, and they pay for the equipment, and they may provide support in some form or fashion. What are you seeing out there today in respect to how organizations are viewing this? Is this the be-all, end-all plan that they want, or are they looking to offload it more?
It depends on who you talk to, right? I mean, every company has their corporate liable supporters, and then there's usually some finance guy that's thrown his opinion into the ring, and it's always, we could save a ton of money just by making everybody get their own device. They're already carrying another device anyway, right? So why not just give them a stipend and throw our data on their device, and doesn't that make sense? So that, there's people from all camps that we talk to. So I think the traditional model is, ideal from the perspective of security. It can be very cost effective. The downfalls is that it also can be expensive if it's not managed properly, and there could be tools that you have to buy and people that you have to invest in order to manage it properly. So while it's most secure, it offers the most flexibility for a company, I think, when it comes to introducing new applications, and you own the device, and there's no question that you own the data, assuming your policy is tight. And so I think from that perspective, it's the preferred method for companies. But the cost lure, that lure of maybe I can do it cheaper is what's kind of pulling people away. And not that there are, again, I think there are users that this model isn't necessary for. I think there are other programs that may work for certain users much better than the traditional model.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen that with this traditional model, the sense of being able to manage an environment is predicated on being able to control it. And this appears on the surface to give the most control and ultimate control. And it'll be interesting as we progress to talk about what control might mean relative to the other models and the other configurations that should be considered in the mix.
Yeah, and one other piece here, I think it's becoming more expensive to maintain a program because the complexity is increasing with different operating systems and with this influx of multiple devices based on user demand. It's becoming tougher. You can't just have a BES administrator anymore who knows everything about the devices and that manages your BES, and you've got your expert. Now that expert has to be an expert on 2, 3, 4 platforms rather than just one, and it becomes more challenging. So.
Mm-hmm. And I would also suppose, and have seen in some organizations where employees don't necessarily accept the devices that are being provided to them. It's a very tactile experience, and they want their iPad, or they'd rather have an iPhone as opposed to a BlackBerry or whatever the case. And I'm sure that's creating some pressures for those that are sticking to the traditional model to expand and offer different solutions, or different makes and models, I should say, just to appease the customers, the users internally. Let's take a look at the next model here, the blended payment model. So this is most traditionally defined by company owns the device, user is responsible for paying for some portion of it. Either it's personal use, or they're just giving, they're given an up to amount, and anything over that they have to pay themselves. You still see a lot of organizations taking this approach, and what drivers do you see behind that?
Well, I think theoretically it's the best of both worlds. It's a way to shift some of that cost burden off of the organization onto the user, while at the same time maintaining all the controls that you mentioned that you get from the traditional model. And we're, frankly, we haven't seen a lot of this in the past. We're seeing it more and more recently, at least as something that organizations are exploring, because again, they're the finance guys looking for ways to shift that cost burden, but the IT guys saying, no, we've got to maintain security. So I think this is a compromise that a lot of companies come to. Some of the challenges are that it can be very difficult to manage from accounts, from just being able to manage from accounts receivable and all the, and accounts payable, and being able to keep track of who owes what, and there has to be a system in place to do that. So that can be really challenging and labor intensive to manage that. So that can be very difficult. And plus the, switching to that kind of system can, there are morale issues to consider and cultural issues within organizations. And, traditionally they've, paid for devices. It can be a shift, especially if you do it to a large number of users. So we've seen companies balk at it for that reason.
Yeah. I have as well, and the accounting strain that you mentioned is certainly a consideration in a large organization. If the employees are not, if there's not, for example, a direct payroll deduction, and the employees have to reimburse the company, that's a whole other layer of well, of accounts receivable and accounts payable, I'll say,
Yeah.
you know, structure that has to be put in place.
Yeah, it can be an accounting mess, that's for sure.
The next model is one that, you know, we've been hearing an awful lot about, and there's certainly companies that are doing this today. There are a lot of companies that are exploring this, and this is the bring your own device model, or the bring your own device model, where organizations bring in their wireless devices, be it just a cell phone or a smartphone or a tablet or whatever it may be, and they're responsible for paying the carrier bill. They're given access to some degree to the corporate network, email, or applications, or a combination thereof. And certainly, I think this has a lot of appeal for people that have their own, you know, users that have their own preferences for devices. So there's a high point on that. What should organizations be thinking about when they begin to deploy a bring your own device model?
Yeah, I think the key are the security aspects to it. I mean, it's a great model in theory, and it can work, but there are definitely steps that need to be taken to ensure that that your data is secure, that there's clear policy and direction in place as to who owns that data and what you're allowed to do to it, because there have been multiple lawsuits across the country, and frankly different precedents set about who owns the data, whether it's the carrier, whether it's the user, whether it's the company. The one trend seems to be that the companies that have an ironclad policy that's signed off on by everyone, that is strictly enforced, those are the companies that tend to be winning those cases. So it seems that is a critical component to the security. And then as well, you get into the whole, I think when people think security, they actually, their mind probably goes to more of the MDM applications that are available and being able to actually secure the data on the device. And, you know, we're getting so much more into just the traditional, can I wipe my data and can I you know, enforce a password and encryption. It's evolving into being able to not only secure email, contact, and calendar, but also corporate applications. The number of corporate applications that are growing drastically. I think AOTMP did a study, and this is actually maybe 8-10 months old, that it had doubled over the previous year, and I'm sure it may even double again. I don't know. Yeah. So we're seeing a huge influx of applications that corporations are using in addition to contact, email, and calendaring, and there's a need to secure that, and is there data that's on the device from those applications, and a lot of the newer MDM applications we're seeing, or the newer features, are centered around being able to provide secure tunnels between the device and the corporation, and being able to not only compartmentalize email, contacts, and calendaring, but also those corporate applications and whatever data goes along with it. So those types of conversations need to be had when you think about this type of program. You know, what are they going to be using the devices for? Some companies, it's still just email, and that's kind of a no-brainer. But if you're talking about, you know, more sensitive data, then it becomes a more serious conversation, especially, you know, with financial services or healthcare, where there are other regulations involved. It can be, you know, an issue that's I think organizations are sometimes a bit short-sighted in their exposure there.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'd be interested to know if included in that set, or in that question of who owns the data, how does the telephone number play into that? Are you running across organizations where they say you can bring your own device, but if you're in a certain role of responsibility and you exit the organization for whatever reason, the number is ours?
Yeah, you know, I've seen that in corporate liable. And then I've seen companies have the conversation around who owns the phone number, and typically users where that's an issue, like salespeople or something, for example, they don't move them to individual liable. They're leaving them on corporate liable so that they own the number. And I've seen some companies start to try to craft policies around being able to keep the number, but I haven't seen that in practice yet. I don't know what your experience has been, but an individual liable user with their number, and then if they leave the company gets that number back. I don't know how that would work.
That's a tough sell, right?
Yeah.
I've talked to several organizations that have brought up that question, and I think that the battle is that you can't have it both ways. If a customer or an employee is going to bring their own device, they're going to go out and get a contract with Verizon or Sprint or whomever, and get a device, and they're going to get the number. Relinquishing that number to the organization, if they've been paying for it all along, is a tough sell. But I bring that up because in days of yore, when the telephone number was potentially the most important thing about the device that that people wanted to maintain for their organization, this throws a wrinkle into the mix.
Yeah, I think the last point to make on this is that there will still be support resources required by the company to support these users, especially if they're providing the email platform for their connectivity. So, if anybody has a problem getting email on their device, they're going to call you first. And even if it may happen to be the phone or their carrier network, which sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's also the server or some glitch with their email delivery system. So that's going to be the first call. So having resources available to manage that is important.
What would you say on that front to an organization that says, well, we're going to provide email access, for example, and all other wireless needs default back to the employee, and they need to contact their carrier and figure out the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what most people think that's going to happen when they move to this model, and so one of two things happens: either they have frustrated users, after this move. It's so difficult to quantify lost productivity by, if it takes longer to replace a device, how much time are your users spending on hold with carriers, dealing with bills and that type of thing. So that's a difficult piece to quantify, but my experience is that there are still significant support requirements. And like I said, our experience is it's about half. But then again, if you bring your own device out to more users, typically the support resources are the same or similar.
Yeah, that's a bit of a paradox. A lot of organizations and a lot of employees want to bring their own device because they want to pick their own device and have a good experience, yet they may be isolated and not have that support, become frustrated if they're left to their own devices.
Yeah, agreed.
Let's take a look at the stipend model, and certainly many organizations I know still subscribe to this model. Typically the end user is going to own the device. They're going to bring the device in. They'll be given X amount of dollars per month, maybe based on their role of responsibility within the organization, to subsidize their business use. What are you seeing today in respect to organizations that are still running strong with this model?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. There tends to be I think organizations go into the stipend model with two different theories. One, either, well, we're going to drastically reduce our cost, and we're going to force some of the cost burden back to the user, and we're going to issue a much smaller stipend, say $20, $25, $30, something like that. Those models tend to make sense, especially with those fence setters that I mentioned earlier. If you've got users that traditionally have had a phone that maybe it's somewhat difficult to justify why they need a corporate phone, maybe they sometimes need it, that's a perfect example of somebody where this kind of model can work. And that smaller stipend where you're not covering the cost of the phone, but you're covering
Stipend model was certainly important back in the days in which taxation, benefits taxes for employees and so forth was kind of in the mix, and organizations wanted to separate themselves from having to pay employment or pay the taxes for the employees and so on and so forth on that model. So.
Yeah, exactly, and it's funny how many people we talk to that still aren't aware that that law had changed over a year ago. So
yeah,
it's but you're right. That initially that was a great motivation, and that's why, especially a lot of public sector, higher education, those type of organizations went to it. It seemed to be who the IRS was attacking at the time, so they all jumped ship. And actually, we're seeing a lot of those come back now. A lot of higher ed organizations are looking at corporate liable and moving a lot of their stipend users back now that the law has changed.
Yeah, yeah. Let's take a look at one additional model, and that's the convenience fee model. End user owns the device, pays the carrier invoice, but also pays the company a fee to access the corporate network. This is kind of an interesting spin. So tell me more about this and what you're seeing out in the market space relative to this model.
I haven't seen this a lot, but actually we have a couple of customers that have rolled it out, and I've been surprised by how many users have actually enrolled. So, they're willing to, they want their corporate data on their phone so bad they're willing to pay their company something to do it. It's usually a small fee, $5 a month or something like that. But it's, I think what the company's idea is that they didn't want to make it free because they wanted to deter some people from doing it, and if you really needed it, then those would be the people that would sign up. So it's a newer model, and I think it's something we'll see more. I think as everybody has smartphones these days, and they all want to get their email, and they usually want to get their company email. A lot of times, they want all that in the same place, and they're willing to pay for that convenience. So I think it's something we'll see more of.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It reminds me of, many years ago, the expectation, for example, in a company was that the coffee was free and it was provided by the company. But in a lot of organizations you go into now, they set up a vending arrangement, and maybe they're not making money on it, but they're probably better than breaking even. And folks are certainly willing to pay for that. And so if the users are getting what they need out of it and the company isn't losing money, that certainly is a very interesting approach to the whole scenario.
Yeah, I think that the policy issues with this are going to be interesting, because if you're actually paying for access, does that mean you own the data? I think there can be an argument made there rather than the company providing some kind of access. So I think companies that are doing this that I've seen these are users that are for sure not going to have sensitive data coming to their phone. So I think if companies are looking at this, that's a critical aspect. We'll see what the legal system comes down with if anybody gets sued. So
right. Well, that would indicate to me that changing your policy, if you were to go to a model like this, for example, to indicate that the convenience fee is purely for support and access, not for content or whatever the appropriate legal language is, would be a really important thing to protect the organization.
Yeah, that was interesting. I guess this is a question. It's really more of a comment that came across, and I think it's an interesting point to make. It's how much of the data, say an employee stores company data in the picture category, can the company look through the file and review your personal items? So that that's another. First of all, compartmentalizing that data, it makes that more important, and secondly, policy is a pretty critical piece, because if you've got access to personal information, I think there was a lawsuit in Pennsylvania where a police officer with his corporate phone was sending private texts, and people saw it, and he sued him and won. So I mean, I don't know how, from if that's not corporately owned, then data, then what is? So it's
right.
It's a difficult situation.
Right. We have to get the content monitoring police out to evaluate that,
Yeah.
in both directions. But I would assume that much like organizations just on their desktop support, many organizations now are having internet breaks, social media breaks, and they're encouraging their employees to utilize company systems for their own private and personal use. And so I would suspect, just beyond the wireless issue, that there's going to be a lot of legal decisions around who owns what content and what can be done and what is what's not only socially acceptable but perhaps even morally acceptable,
Yeah.
on these, when you're using these devices.
The NFL is not a customer. So.
No, probably a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, in thinking about all these models and not so much picking one and saying this is the one for me, you shuffle the deck and grab the right one. That might be the solution. But I think where really what I'm hearing from you and from what MOBI has been doing is taking the best of each world here and organizing it in a manner that it really fits that customer's specific needs and that particular solution. So in thinking about that, one of the things that you certainly want to do is understand the users and profile the different users and profile their experience so that you can fit the right solution in there. So let's talk a little bit about the profiling system that you have, and we'll start with the what you're calling the high category users.
Yeah, I would say first of all, this is a very simplified version of profiling, and we've seen companies get involved in something much more complex with rating systems and scores and that kind of thing. So I just want to point out in the beginning that this is a very simplified version of what is possible, and it really just depends on the company. I think the concept, though, is that you've got users that have either depending on their role in the company, they could be C-level executives, their access to sensitive data within the company. A lot of times is dependent on that role. A lot of times not. An executive assistant a lot of times has access to a ton of data, and I wouldn't necessarily consider them, having a critical role within the organization, although I'm sure a lot of executive assistants probably
would. Yeah, executives may disagree with that.
Yeah, exactly. And then the timeliness, how critical is it that you get a hold of somebody immediately? Because and again, this is a very difficult number to quantify, but downtime for individual liable users is going to be higher. Now, how much higher? It's really tough to tell, but it is higher. So if it's critical, you get a hold of somebody immediately, then that's another factor here. So the medium category, and these are more of the fence sitters that we've had, where you've got people that the high users or the lows are the easy ones. It's the ones that are in the middle somewhere that you've got to make a decision on whether, and this is a case where maybe a stipend, a lower stipend, like a $20, $30 stipend makes a lot of sense because you're paying for a part of their service and yet not all the service, and you're pushing some of that cost burden back. And every company is going to be different, and they're going to have to make these decisions based on different roles. I think the key is being able to identify the roles and then be able to have a system in place that you can, put these people in these different categories, inventory those categories, know who's in what category, and then make sure that whatever business rules are applied to that category are done so efficiently. And that tends to be the challenge with this. And this creates complexity for companies having different categories, different programs within their organization. So, but in the end, the goal is to reduce costs, to potentially reduce your burden administratively, and to increase security, and in the end, really increase visibility to corporate information across your company. Making people more mobile is in theory should make people more productive.
If you were to take a look, and as you'd said before, a lot of folks might default to the medium category simply because they have that blend of requirements. Just in terms of percentages, do you think that most organizations have medium and low? Do you find that the type of business really predicates where users might be profiled? Or talk to me about that a little bit.
It really depends on the type of business. I mean, it's there are higher risk verticals, I guess, where you've got healthcare, for example. You've got more people with patient information on devices than ever before. So those situations, obviously, the sensitivity and the access is going to be very high for those organizations for a lot of their employees. So in those cases, it may make more sense to have more corporate liable than individual liable, bring your own device, stipend, whatever other model you're looking at. And then there may be where you get into a manufacturing organization, and there could be a huge number of employees that timeliness isn't important. There isn't sensitive data. They're not high on the totem pole, and you can have a lot of stipend users, or even bring your own device users, or convenience fee users, or something like that. So I think it depends on the vertical, depends on the company, it depends on the culture, and every company kind of has to figure this out on their own. I think trying to simplify it into some kind of a rating system like this can make it easier, because when you try to go to every department and ask them, that's when you never get a decision made and nothing ever happens. So
right. I heard I think it was probably like a USA Today poll of college students that said most students would give up internet access before they gave up their phone, or they give up telephone before they gave up their, or excuse me, give up TV before they gave up their phone. And it'll be, I'm kind of interested, particularly when interviewing users about, their thought on timeliness and all of that, how personal experiences might flow over into the business experience, and so, to make everything a demand. But I think that this is a really good model to help categorize and organize the different approaches that you might take, so that you can come up with that right blended approach to support the organization overall.
Absolutely.
So let's think about those organizations that are corporate liable and they're switching to an individual liable type program. What's the tick list of things that they need to have in their radar to support?
Yeah, and we've touched on some of these, so we'll go through some of them quickly. Who owns the phone number? We talked about that. That's a critical question to ask. And are you moving people that it's acceptable to lose that number? So that's one question. The transfer of liability is a challenge for companies, and being able to process multiple transfer of liabilities for potentially thousands of users can be an administrative nightmare. And being able to schedule the transition around upgrades. Are you going to, is your company willing to eat all the early termination fees that they might have by moving users, or are they going to try to schedule it so that users are only transitioned after their contract's up? That again can be an administrative nightmare. However, it can also delay or kind of trickle in the number of people that are actually transitioning, which can make it a little easier. But that's another critical question to ask. And this is one that most of the companies we ask have not even thought of, and that's the fact that traditionally 20 to 25% of people that try to get a cell phone are denied, or are asked to pay some kind of a deposit on the phone. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do about those users? Are you going to, are they even going to tell you? Are you just assuming that they have a phone? So being able to provide some kind of program for them, are you going to pay force them to pay that deposit? It's a question that some companies, it's a bigger issue than others, depending on, we have one high-profile company that has a lot of engineers, and their rejection rate's between 1% and 2%. And then there are other manufacturing-type companies where it is up to 15%, 20%. So it's a question to be considered in how you're going to handle those users.
Sure, that's a really good point, and I think that those types of issues not only cover the financial aspect and the employees, but there can be some emotional stress for the employees along those lines as well. So yeah, that's a really good thing to consider.
Yeah,
we talked about email and applications, and a bit about MDM. One question I might have around ActiveSync, is that the solution that you're seeing that is, or the email solution that you're seeing that's most commonly deployed to support email?
Yeah, I think as far as most common, I would say it's very common. It's very common among corporate liable users for sure. We're actually seeing, and I think the Exchange, the 2010 version, has some features in ActiveSync that didn't exist with earlier versions that have made it even easier for companies to use this. There are still challenges with ActiveSync. Probably the biggest is that you can't really isolate or compartmentalize corporate data from personal. So if they access the device, lose it, they're losing everything if you wipe it. Also, the wiping capabilities, I've heard some questions as to how reliable it can be. So there are some challenges, but overall, I think ActiveSync has improved. And we're actually seeing also a lot of companies, and I wish I had a percentage, but maybe 50-50 that have ActiveSync versus some other type of email platform like Good Technology or Bez or Mobile Iron or other solutions that are available to companies to control the content that users have on personal devices.
Got it. Got it. What about the process itself? We touched a little bit upon how to manage early termination fees, some end of life for plans if you're going from a corporate liable to an individual liable scenario. What other thoughts would you have on the transition process regarding approvals and support resources needed?
Yeah, and I mean that is another aspect to what we have to manage in this, and that is that approval process. Are you going to require approval if somebody wants to transition even though they're still under contract? So maybe eating that early termination fee requires approval. Or are you going to, if somebody tries to opt into a stipend program that wasn't receiving a phone before, is that going to require some kind of approval? How do you process those? How do you document those? And are you going to try to do it in somewhat a manual fashion, or are you going to have a system in place to do it? Not every company has that. Some do, some don't. And then being able to inventory who has access, who should have access, and then being able to butt that inventory up with who actually has access, so that you can manage the end of life, whether somebody leaves the company, whether they change devices, that type of situation. And then during that transition, another major consideration is, so if you're moving a bunch of BlackBerry users from corporate liable and they're getting individual and they're getting new phones, you've got to have a system in place to collect those old BlackBerries and wipe that data, and there's security and environmental issues and a lot of processes involved to manage that as well. I did see one real interesting comment here on the question. It was talking about potential HR issues, that if somebody can't get a phone because of credit and then they're passed over for a promotion or something, does that open a company to lawsuits? And it's a situation I hadn't really thought of, but I could easily see where that would happen.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I think that could happen, and certainly if they say that having a device, a mobile device, is a requirement of the position,
yes,
and then they can't get that, and I mean, there could be a lot of potential HR issues there, and I would assume that certain states would be perhaps very lenient on that, and others very difficult.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Somebody has asked whether this would be available later on recording, and it will be. So I wanted to answer that question.
Perfect. And then the support and report stage here, as you're going through the transition from corporate to individual liable, users are going to have issues, challenges, questions along the way. There could perhaps be issues that are more technical connectivity between the devices and the internal business systems and all of that. So what are the things that organizations should be considering around support and knowing what's going on, what stage it is, where it is, and so forth?
I think the one consistent thing I've heard about companies that have gone through this process is, to a company, they all said, wow, it took a lot longer than we thought it would. I mean, it's always a greater administrative burden than what people think. And having the support in place to manage the transition is key. And then, as I've said, the ongoing support after, being able to ensure if you requiring somebody to have a phone and email, and then they're not getting email, they have to have a place to call. I mean, if that's, especially if it's part of their job. So you've got to have support available for that. They're not just going to be able to call the carrier, especially if you have an MDM or if you're using ActiveSync especially. There are internal resources involved. And then, as we mentioned before, managing the inventory and making sure that users that have access are listed on an HR feed that actually are supposed to have access. And then when people leave the company, you make sure that they're removed, and there's a process for that. Large organizations can require a lot.
Yeah. I know that there's a lot of variables to this next question I have, but can you put maybe into context, if an organization, hypothetical, they have 2,000 devices that are corporate liable, and they're looking to move half of them to individual liable, and they undertake this effort on their own. They've laid out their plans, They know what they're going to do. Project plans in front of them, you know, and they go forth and conquer. How much effort would you suppose if they were going on or going about this on their own, or how much time, I should say, not effort, but how much time do you think it would take for them to complete that?
Well, we've seen, and I guess it really depends on the number of internal resources that are dedicated, but we've seen projects that have taken 18 months to completely process when they expected it to take 3. That's like one of the horror stories I heard.
Sure.
But there are, consistently it's taking 2 to 3 times longer than what companies think. So that's something that, and frankly, that's not a survey that's my own internal clock telling me that it's approximately 2 to 3 times longer, and that's what I hear consistently from companies. So, and I think companies that have the infrastructure to deal with it, whether it's the right tools or even support organizations, that tend to do a lot better.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's something to keep in mind, and particularly, I guess, with any project that you're embarking upon. If it's taking, if you've never done it before and you don't have the experience, there's going to be a learning curve to it. But 2 to 3 times, it would seem to me that, in an example like I use, where maybe it's 1,000 devices, and if it takes them 2 to 3 times longer, there's also perhaps a benefit lost. Not just that they haven't gained the new state benefit, but they could be spending a lot more time, effort, and energy on that, and money, getting to that state if they're not prepared for it and they don't have their proverbial ducks in a row.
Well, we keep talking about how much longer it takes to and how much more it costs to process these transitions, how much more expensive it is than what companies think, and that's a big piece of it. I mean, if it takes you 18 months to transition versus 3, then your ROI is shot. So
right.
It's you're talking about years before you see any kind of recovery.
Right. It's upside down pretty quickly.
Yeah. And one of the things that we had another question about what kind of information might be available. We will also be offering an ebook to the people that attended that it goes through a lot of this in detail and actually provides a lot more detail into what companies should consider when they're making these transitions, or what caveats they might run into.
Yeah, that'll be good. Tie together all these thoughts, and I've seen the ebook. It's great.
Great.
So good. What do you have any other questions that have come across here?
One of the other things, somebody just really asked, kind of teed up in our last slide here, asking, what's available to help. And I think whether you look at MOBI or whether you look at another company, I think being able to centralize all that wireless contact information, centralize procurement and billing, and having a consistent system for tracking inventory, billing, and being able to tie it all together is important. We see a lot of organizations that have different siloed pieces of information, whether it's, procurement might be in one area, break fix in another, billing in another, and they're all working off different subsets of data. That can cause a problem. So having a central location for that and a central system to access that is critical, we've found. That policy piece is, especially with this individual liable situation, has been really critical in being able to mitigate the risk that can exist with this kind of transition. Reporting, being able to report is critical. We've discussed the support, and then as far as being able to rebill and being able to work with accounting departments within companies and being able to have these different programs that have different, whether it's a stipend or whether it's a blended model where the user's being charged back, or whether it's a convenience fee, or whether it's just a traditional corporate liable that you have to allocate costs accurately, and being able to manage all that in a central location is can be daunting if you're trying to do it on spreadsheets. So, and we see that quite a bit.
Absolutely.
Actually. There's a question here that came across kind of related to this also. Do you believe that the end result will be a hybrid solution managing both CRU and IRU devices? Must be an AT&T customer.
There you go. Yeah.
Yes, I do. I think eventually, you see the pendulum swing back and forth. Eventually, I think it will settle where companies are going to have a blend of all models. I think there will, I hate to say always, for a long time there will be a need for corporate liable users with most organizations, but there's also going to be the opportunity to move users that have been traditionally corporate liable to some kind of a blended model or stipend model or something. So I think the days of saying you need to be all corporate liable or you're not secure are over. And I think anybody who is short-sighted to not try to be open-minded to a lot of the changes that have taken place, and I think that's for sure something that we'll see.
This is an interesting question about an example of a company's blended model. Do you have a prototype we could talk about that would illustrate what the blend looks like?
Yeah, we have a large corporate 10 company that we manage that they actually have a blended model where they're corporate liable users. They actually have a bunch of different programs in place. One of their programs is a blended model with corporate liable users, and they actually a percentage of the usage cost is passed back to the user, and so they're assuming that 30% of the calls that are on that user's device are personal, and they're assuming 70% are business. So whatever the calculated cost for that user is, and we actually do a rebuilt solution for them, so we're using actual usage from that user and a cost per minute and showing them. So this user actually costs you $47.84. The voice costs $28.55. 30% of that is going to be charged back to the user on his payroll. So that's an example of a blended model that we do for a company, and there are a multitude of different ways. I've actually seen just a fixed model where everybody gets charged $20. I think the reason they were doing that is just they didn't have the resources to do anything more complex than that. But we're seeing more and more of that. That's one example.
Yeah, that's good. And I too as well have seen lots of different examples. One of the things that I encourage all organizations to think about is that unless you can say for 100% sure that one singular model is going to support you from here until for the next 3 years or 5 years or whatever the case is, keeping an open mind about what the benefits to different types of users under different circumstances might be is a good idea. And even if your blended model is 95% corporate liable, for example, and 5% something else, right, just to be able to support those individual needs, that creates an environment in which you can have an open opportunity to evolve as technology demands or technology changes, user demands change, and even preferences change as to what the devices might be. So I don't see us being in a mode anymore in which there's a single, the model is X, and it's one of these models that's laid out, and it's probably just corporate liable. So I agree wholeheartedly with what you said.
Any other questions? I think we had a couple other.
Yeah, there was a question here about are companies able to reduce their support staff needed after they move to employee liable? And I think we touched on some of the challenges of that before, but it seems to be a little bit of a all or nothing type statement, right? Oh, I go to individual liable, therefore my support staff goes down. Do you have any experiences or any exact comments on client's experience?
We've touched on it. It really depends on if you are just offering a stipend to certain users and you're not opening that program up to more users, which is typically the case, but if you're keeping the same number of users, typically your support staff will be cut in half for each user that you move. So if you normally have 4 people supporting 1,000 users, if you move half of those 1,500 to IL, then you could cut one person. Mm-hmm. So that would be that's a very it's a simple way to mention something that's a very complex decision, but that's typically what we see. So the problem is most companies open it up to more people. Say, well, we're going to do BYD, we'll just open it up the whole company. So they end up with twice as many users they had before, so the staff stays the same.
Right. Got it. There was also a good question here about the different categories of users. Complexity is being created by having different categories of users. I thought we were trying to reduce the complexity of the program. How can you manage that? So I think that really speaks to the thought that the different categories are meant to help simplify who might be on what model, but does managing that create another problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, companies like us exist because these situations are very complex, and managing that complexity is why we exist, or why departments at companies exist, to try to manage that complexity. So having the right tools, having the right systems in place is absolutely critical. And I see over and over companies trying to manage complexity with very simple systems, and it just typically doesn't work very well.
Overwhelms the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We did get another question here around whether corporate liable is going to be forced on certain regulated industries. I haven't seen that. The only thing I've seen is with HIPAA, the high-tech initiative that's coming, that's in certain states, has certain requirements that would be very challenging to enforce on individual liable. Now, I know there are some MDNs that seem to potentially be able to do that, but I haven't seen anything that's going to require corporate liable. But I think companies are going to be really challenged to manage IL with certain HIPAA regulations coming. That's the big one that I've seen. I don't know, Tim, if you've seen any other industries that.
Yeah, it's compliance that needs to be mandated, and a lot of times it defaults to CL because that's the way in which the organizations feel that they can handle that. So certainly there are some things in the finance industry, HIPAA, insurance, healthcare, things like that, and also with student records, universities, things like that. There are compliance procedures that have to be in place. I think that with compliance, one of the things is at the end of the day, if you can do it with a wish and a prayer and it works, so be it, however you choose to manage it. Wouldn't suggest that to anybody, but, you want to be able to cover up.
We have one more minute, and I have one really good question that came in. Do you have a percent range of enterprises moving versus small SMBs? And I would say I've seen it all over the board. I haven't seen a percent one way or the other. It seems to be it's a conversation I'm having practically every day with someone, and they tend to be medium to large businesses. I think a lot of smaller businesses are, one carrier, 100 lines, one person can manage it. They're not seeing a big issue. But medium to large businesses, it seems to be across the board. I don't know if that's been your experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would agree with that.
And second part, and any indication of who moves back? Do you see any government regulation coming that, I already mentioned that part, the CL part. And the only thing the big trend I'm seeing in who's moving back is higher education. I kind of mentioned that. Seeing that a lot of those organizations, maybe for the reasons you just mentioned with some of the regulations that are coming or that exist. So I think that's the trend I'm seeing. Otherwise, financial services tends to be moving mostly IL for some reason. I think these verticals tend to move like in packs. It's like you see one move, they all start to move that way, whether it makes sense or not. Anyway, that's what I'm seeing. I don't know if you're seeing similar trends.
The only thing I would add to that is, and this isn't so much industry-centric, but in terms of going back to CL, we see a lot of organizations that have had either failed or challenged migrations to IL. So they start going down that path, and maybe they are 2 to 3x into their implementation time frame, and there is no light at the end of the tunnel. Or, there's been a change in philosophy, and they say, let's retreat, not switch back. And so that approach, and unfortunately that has happened, and I think to the point made earlier, having the right tools, the right experience, and the right partners in place to help you, manage that migration, that would certainly eliminate that retreat mode.
Yeah.
So, real good. Well, thanks everybody for participating today. Certainly thought that the information shared was very interesting. There will be follow-up. As Brandon mentioned, there will be an e-book that will be delivered to the participants, and this recording will be available, or will be made available. So thanks so much for your time, Brandon. Thought it was a great discussion and some really good information about where we need to be going in the future with managing wireless.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody that attended.